He thought forcing the quiet office woman to touch a priceless concert violin would buy him a few cheap laughs, but Maestro Vincent Holloway had no idea he was walking straight into the most humiliating moment of his celebrated career. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe dignity still matters in this world, stay with this story, because what happened inside Robertson Conservatory that winter evening left some of the finest names in classical music unable to speak. The grand recital hall shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off polished mahogany walls and rows of gold-trimmed velvet seats. Wealth whispered from every corner of the room. Women in silk gowns adjusted diamond bracelets. Men in black tuxedos checked engraved programs. On stage, the nation's most gifted violin student stood in a tense semicircle, clutching instruments worth more than most American homes. At the center of it all stood Maestro Vincent Holloway, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, and radiating the kind of authority that made people lower their voices when he passed. For 27 years, Holloway had ruled the conservatory like a king in patent leather shoes. Critics praised him, donors adored him, and terrified students treated his smallest nod like a royal blessing. Tonight was the annual scholarship gala, the event that could launch a young musician into Carnegie Hall or bury them in obscurity forever. Holloway intended it to be flawless. Then his star soloist failed. The young man's bow trembled halfway through a brutal Paganini caprice. One missed run became two, then three, and within seconds the piece collapsed into a thin, ugly scramble of broken notes. A hush fell across the hall. Holloway's nostrils flared. He hated mistakes, but more than that, he hated losing control in public. The boy lowered his violin, cheeks burning, while a few patrons exchanged embarrassed glances. Holloway inhaled slowly, searching for a way to recover his dominance, and that was when his eyes drifted toward the side aisle. Standing beside a folding table stacked with sheet music was Clara Bennett. 38 years old, plain brown cardigan, navy skirt that had clearly seen better years, low sensible shoes, chestnut hair twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She was so invisible most guests had mistaken her for custodial staff. For 6 months Clara had moved through Robertson Conservatory like a shadow, copying scores, labeling folders, arranging chairs, fetching coffee no one thanked her for. Students called her the office lady when they bothered to notice her at all. Holloway had never learned more than her first name. But now, in this room full of nervous elites and disappointed donors, he saw something useful, a harmless target. His lips curled. "Well," he said, his voice gliding smoothly into the microphone, "perhaps tonight we should lower the standards." A ripple of uneasy laughter fluttered through the audience. Holloway turned and pointed directly at Clara. "Miss Bennett," he called, loud enough that every head in the hall snapped toward her, "you spend enough time carrying violins around. Why don't you come up here and show us how it's done?" For one suspended second, Clara did not move. Her fingers tightened around the stack of programs in her arms. Several students smirked. One donor chuckled behind a gloved hand. Someone near the front whispered, "This should be entertaining." Holloway smiled wider, enjoying the shift of attention, enjoying the room's hunger for a spectacle that wasn't his failed protege. "Come now," he added, each word dipped in condescension, "unless the instrument is too advanced for office work." The laughter came louder this time. Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward the stage, and though her face remained composed, something unreadable flickered behind them. She set the programs down with trembling care. Then, under hundreds of amused stares, the quiet woman in the faded cardigan began walking toward the brightest lights in the conservatory. Each step Clara Bennett took seemed to echo far louder than the laughter that followed her. The polished maple floor beneath her sensible shoes clicked softly through the enormous recital hall, and with every measured footfall, the distance between invisibility and exposure grew smaller. Students leaned sideways in their seats to get a better look at the woman they usually ignored in the copy room. Wealthy patrons smiled with the polite cruelty of people who assumed they were about to witness harmless embarrassment. Even the scholarship judges, seated beneath the brass lamps in the front row, exchanged amused glances over their printed score sheets. Clara kept her eyes lowered. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned long ago that crowds often mistook silence for weakness. On stage, Maestro Vincent Holloway folded his arms and waited, his silver cuff links glinting beneath the chandelier light. He had regained control of the evening, and everyone could feel it. The failed student had become an afterthought. Now the hall belonged once again to Vincent Holloway and his talent for orchestrating humiliation with elegant precision. "Wonderful," he said as Clara climbed the 3 shallow steps to the stage. "Our evening may yet produce some unexpected comedy." More laughter. Clara stopped 6 feet from him. Up close, the contrast between them was almost theatrical. Holloway in his tailored black tuxedo, every strand of silver hair disciplined into place, posture sharpened by decades of applause. Clara in her faded cardigan, sleeves pushed slightly at the wrists from years of office work, a woman who looked as though she should be carrying binders instead of standing under concert lights. Holloway gestured toward an assistant, who carefully brought forward the conservatory's crown jewel, a 1719 Stradivarius violin donated by a New York patron and insured for nearly $2 million. A low murmur moved through the room. Students straightened immediately. Some looked offended that such an instrument was about to be touched by someone outside their sacred circle. Holloway noticed their discomfort and enjoyed it. "Do be careful, Miss Bennett," he said, handing her the violin with exaggerated caution. "This instrument has survived 3 centuries. I would hate for office clumsiness to finish it off." A wave of restrained chuckles rolled through the audience again. Clara accepted the violin with both hands. The moment her fingers touched the aged amber wood, something shifted so subtly no one but she could feel it. Her breath caught. The varnish was warm beneath the stage lights. The familiar curve of the neck settled into her palm like the return of a language she had once spoken more fluently than speech itself. For a brief second, the glittering hall vanished. She saw another room, another lifetime, another stage flooded with white light and thunderous applause that she had not allowed herself to remember in years. Clara swallowed hard and blinked the memory away. Holloway was still speaking, still enjoying himself. "Perhaps a scale," he suggested to the audience. "Let us not be too ambitious." Several students smirked openly now. One young violinist whispered to another, "She probably does not even know how to tighten the bow." Holloway turned back to Clara and offered her a bow as though granting a child permission to play dress-up. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his smile thin as paper. Clara looked out across the hall for the first time. Hundreds of eyes. Some mocking. Some curious. Some simply waiting for the inevitable collapse. At the far right, she noticed the scholarship panel, including an elderly guest judge with round spectacles and a weathered face she almost recognized. He was not laughing. He was studying her with faint puzzlement, as if searching through a memory he could not quite reach. Clara then lowered her gaze to the violin resting against her shoulder. Her left hand slid naturally into first position. Her chin settled against the ebony rest. The movement was so fluid, so practiced, that the nearest student stopped smiling. Holloway noticed it too, but only for a heartbeat. He lifted one eyebrow, still certain of his little performance. "Well then," he announced. "Let us hear what the office can do." Clara raised the bow. The hall inhaled. And in that suspended instant before horsehair met string, the entire conservatory stood unknowingly at the edge of a revelation none of them were prepared to survive. The first note did not sound like uncertainty. It sounded like memory. A single clear tone rose from the Stradivarius and floated through the recital hall with such purity that the laughter died before it could fully leave anyone's throat. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The note hung beneath the chandeliers like a beam of cold light, flawless and unwavering, and for one strange second the entire room forgot to breathe. Clara Bennett drew the bow slowly, her wrist relaxed, her shoulders loose, her eyes lowered not in fear now, but in concentration so complete it seemed she had disappeared somewhere beyond the hall itself. Then came the second phrase. Richer. Deeper. The opening line of Paganini unfolded from the instrument with a confidence that sent several students sitting upright all at once. One young violinist actually lowered his own instrument from his lap, blinking as if he had misheard. Maestro Vincent Holloway's smile held for a moment longer, but it no longer reached his eyes. Clara shifted positions with effortless precision. Her fingers moved along the fingerboard not like someone guessing, not like someone remembering an old hobby, but like someone whose muscles had lived inside this language for decades. Fast passages that had reduced the scholarship soloist to trembling fragments now poured from her with crystalline control. Every run landed clean. Every transition breathed. There was no strain, no panic, no searching. Just command. The kind of command that cannot be taught in 6 months or 6 years. The kind forged only through a lifetime of devotion and sacrifice. A hush fell so heavily across Robertson Conservatory that the faint whisper of horsehair against string became audible even in the back row. Patrons who had been smiling now stared forward with parted lips. One woman slowly lowered her champagne glass without realizing it. A donor in the second row leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Who is she?" but she did not answer because she was too stunned to look away. Holloway's folded arms loosened. His jaw shifted once. Clara continued. She was no longer playing for them. That much was suddenly obvious. The mocking faces, the velvet seats, the scholarship gala, the smug maestro beside her, none of it seemed to exist in the world she had entered. There was only the violin and the torrent of years she had apparently locked somewhere unreachable. Her bow accelerated into the caprice's vicious middle section, the sequence every advanced student in the room knew required impossible stamina and terrifying left-hand agility. Yet Clara moved through it with almost serene calm. Notes flashed like silver rain. Double stops rang with authority. Harmonics shimmered bright and glass-like over the stunned silence. One student in the rear actually muttered, "No way," under his breath. Another simply shook his head. Near the judge's table, the elderly guest adjudicator with round spectacles suddenly lurched forward in his seat. His pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the polished wood. His eyes narrowed behind the lenses, studying Clara's posture, her bow hold, the distinct inward tilt of her left wrist. Recognition was clawing its way toward him. Holloway heard the man inhale sharply, but he could not turn away from the woman beside him. For the first time that evening, Vincent Holloway looked small. Not physically, not in stature, but in certainty. The room he had controlled so easily minutes before was no longer his. Every ounce of attention had shifted to Clara Bennett, and unlike his cultivated authority, has required no announcement. It radiated from every note. Clara lifted into the final ascending phrase, each pitch climbing cleaner, brighter, more breathtaking than the last, until the music seemed to stretch beyond the conservatory walls themselves. When she landed the closing chord, she did not flourish. She did not seek approval. She simply let the final vibration dissolve into the stunned air. No one moved. No one clapped. No one even whispered. The silence that followed was not polite. It was the kind of silence born when an entire room realizes, all at once, that it has made a terrible mistake. It was the elderly judge who shattered the silence first. His chair scraped sharply across the hardwood as he stood so suddenly that several heads turned toward him in alarm. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the adjudication table, and behind the round lenses of his spectacles, his eyes had widened with something far beyond surprise. It was disbelief mixed with memory. "That bow hold," he murmured, though the microphone above the judges captured every trembling syllable. "Good Lord." The whisper rolled through the speakers and across the hall like a dropped crystal glass. Clara Bennett remained still beneath the stage lights, the Stradivarius resting quietly at her side, her breathing measured, her expression unreadable. She looked neither proud nor nervous. If anything, she looked like a woman who had simply completed an ordinary task and was waiting for permission to return to work. But nothing in Robertson Conservatory was ordinary anymore. Maestro Vincent Holloway blinked once, then twice, as if his mind were refusing the evidence directly in front of him. He had expected clumsy scraping, a few broken notes, perhaps some awkward laughter and a restored sense of his own superiority. Instead, he was standing beside a performance that would have silenced half the violin faculty in New York. Holloway cleared his throat, searching desperately for language that could return him to authority. "Well," he said, though the word emerged thin and brittle, "that was unexpectedly competent." Competent! The absurdity of it hung in the air. No one laughed this time. Several students turned toward him with expressions that bordered on offense, as though even they knew the word was embarrassingly insufficient. The elderly judge took 2 slow steps closer to the stage stairs, still staring at Clara. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice unsteady now, "would you please look at me?" Clara lifted her eyes. The instant their gazes met, the old man inhaled sharply and placed one hand over his chest. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew there was something in the wrist." Murmurs erupted across the audience. Scholarship donors leaned toward one another. Faculty members frowned in confusion. Holloway's composure slipped another inch. "Judge Halston," he interrupted with a strained smile, "I am sure we can discuss technicalities later. The gala must continue." But Judge Leonard Halston did not even glance at him. For 40 years Halston had served as one of the most respected names in American string adjudication, a man who had judged competitions from Boston to San Francisco, and now his face had gone almost pale beneath the brass lights. "Technicalities," he repeated, I still locked on Clara. "Vincent, do you have any idea who this woman is?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Holloway stared. Several faculty members exchanged baffled looks. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the violin, the first visible sign that this moment unsettled her more than the performance itself. Holloway gave a short dismissive laugh that fooled no one. "She is an administrative employee," he said. "A filing assistant." Judge Halston shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "No," he replied. 15 years ago, before half this room knew what a conservatory audition was, there was a prodigy from Connecticut who won every youth concerto competition she entered. Critics called her the brightest American violinist of her generation. Juilliard offered her a full scholarship at 17. Vienna invited her before she turned 20. The audience had gone motionless again. Students stared from Halston to Clara and back as though trying to merge 2 impossible images into one. Holloway's mouth opened, then closed. Halston swallowed. Her name was Clara Bennett. A collective gasp swept through the hall. One violin student actually covered her mouth. Another whispered that Clara Bennett, as if speaking too loudly might somehow undo reality. Holloway turned toward the quiet woman beside him, truly looking at her now for perhaps the first time in 6 months. Not the cardigan. Not the office shoes. Not the folders she carried every morning. Her hands. Her posture. The terrifying calm in her eyes. And as recognition finally began to dawn, the maestro who had built a career on identifying talent felt something cold slide through his stomach, because he understood in one devastating instant that he had not merely mocked a secretary in front of his conservatory. He had publicly ridiculed a vanished legend. The name moved through Robertson Conservatory like an electric current. Clara Bennett. Students who had spent years memorizing competition winners suddenly looked as if they had seen a ghost step out of an old magazine cover. Faculty members leaned toward one another in urgent whispers. Even the donors, many of whom knew little about technique, could sense from the sheer panic spreading across distinguished faces that this was no ordinary revelation. Maestro Vincent Holloway stood frozen beside Clara, and the polished confidence that had carried him through the evening was beginning to crack in plain sight. He searched his memory frantically. Clara Bennett. The prodigy from Connecticut. The girl who had disappeared after a meteoric rise. He remembered now. Newspaper features. International youth circuits. Critics calling her America's answer to the European violin dynasties. Then nothing. No farewell tour. No final interview. She had simply vanished, leaving the classical world to invent rumors in her absence. Illness. Marriage. Burnout. Religious retreat. Holloway had heard all of them over the years and dismissed them as one more wasted genius story. Yet here she was, wearing a discount cardigan and office shoes, standing 5 feet from him with his own conservatory's prized Stradivarius resting quietly in her hand. The humiliation was not loud, but it was total. Holloway tried to recover. Men like Vincent Holloway did not survive nearly 3 decades at the top without instinctively reaching for control when dignity began slipping away. He forced a thin chuckle. "Well," he said, smoothing the front of his tuxedo, "Robertson certainly hires interesting administrative help." The attempt landed dead. No one smiled. In fact, several faces in the audience visibly tightened. Holloway was hearing it now for the first time in his life, the sound of a joke failing because the room no longer respected the man telling it. Judge Halston climbed the stage stairs with surprising speed for a man in his 70s. When he reached Clara, his expression softened into something almost paternal. "You disappeared after the Vienna Invitational," he said quietly, though every microphone still carried his words. "People searched for you for years." Clara lowered her eyes for a moment. "Life became louder than music," she answered. The simplicity of the sentence somehow made the hall even quieter. There was no dramatic speech, no invitation for sympathy, but those 5 words contained an ocean no one dared cross with further questions. Holloway swallowed. He suddenly felt overdressed, overexposed, and absurdly small beneath the chandeliers that had once made him feel invincible. One of his senior violin students, a young woman named Elise Turner, slowly stood from her seat. Elise had spent 3 years worshipping Holloway's every correction, treating his approval like oxygen. Now she stared not at him, but at Clara. "Maestro," she said carefully, "you made her carry my sheet folders last Tuesday." The sentence was not hostile. It did not need to be. It was factual, and facts often cut deeper than accusation. A nervous ripple passed through the students as memory after memory began surfacing. Clara organizing rosin. Clara adjusting stands. Clara quietly replacing broken strings in practice rooms. Clara fetching coffee while aspiring soloists complained in front of her about wrist fatigue and finger discipline to a woman who had clearly forgotten more about violin than any of them had ever learned. Holloway felt heat rising into his collar. For months he had treated genius like clerical labor because it arrived in plain clothes and spoke softly. Robertson Conservatory, the institution that prided itself on identifying exceptional talent, had failed the simplest test imaginable, recognizing greatness when it was not wrapped in glamour. Clara shifted the violin gently and extended it back toward the stunned assistant. Her movements were calm, almost merciful. She did not use the moment to grandstand. She did not lecture anyone. That made the shame around her infinitely heavier. Holloway reached instinctively to say something, anything that might patch the hole widening beneath his reputation, but before he could form a sentence, Judge Halston turned toward the audience and said in a clear resonant voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, you are standing in the presence of the finest violin talent this conservatory has seen in 20 years, and we nearly reduced her to an after-dinner joke." The room went dead still. Because everyone understood that the word nearly did not soften the truth at all. No applause came after Judge Halston's words. Applause would have been too easy, too convenient, almost a way for the room to forgive itself. What filled Robertson Conservatory instead was something far heavier, collective embarrassment. The donors sat motionless with programs resting forgotten in their laps. Students who had laughed 10 minutes earlier now stared at the floor as if the polished wood might hide them from their own memory. Faculty members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that every dismissive glance they had ever thrown Clara Bennett's way had become part of a much larger indictment. And at the center of it stood Maestro Vincent Holloway, a man who had built his entire identity on the claim that he could recognize excellence before anyone else. Tonight, under the brightest lights in the building, that claim had quietly collapsed. Holloway opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Miss Bennett," he began, forcing his tone toward civility, "if we had known..." Clara looked at him, and he stopped. There was nothing aggressive in her gaze, nothing theatrical, but there was a steadiness that made excuses sound childish before they were spoken. Holloway swallowed the rest of the sentence. Around them, the silence sharpened. Judge Halston stepped aside slightly, giving Clara the center of the stage without formally announcing it. It was an instinctive transfer of authority, and everyone felt it. The woman who had entered this hall as invisible office help was now the still point around which every eye revolved. One of the younger scholarship candidates, a 19-year-old violinist named Nathan Cole, rose slowly from his chair. His face was flushed with shame. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice cracking, "you fixed my shoulder rest 2 weeks ago when I complained that my vibrato felt unstable." Clara gave a small nod. Nathan stared at her as if replaying the memory in disbelief. "You told me my wrist was too tense." A faint murmur spread through the student section. Another stood. Then another. Clara had adjusted tuning pegs, replaced frayed strings, reorganized, annotated scores, and offered tiny practical suggestions that most of them had accepted with absent-minded impatience, never imagining the quiet office woman understood every flaw in their playing with terrifying precision. What they had interpreted as clerical helpfulness had actually been restrained expertise. Holloway felt each realization in the room tightening around him like invisible wire. This was no longer about one humiliating joke gone wrong. This was about an institution full of trained ears, expensive educations, and cultivated arrogance failing to identify mastery because mastery had not arrived wearing a headline. "Why did you never say anything?" Elise Turner asked from the front row, her voice almost pleading. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Why carry folders? Why answer phones? Why tolerate condescension from students who could not play one quarter as well? Clara rested her hands lightly in front of her. For the first time, her composure seemed touched by something softer, almost tired. "Because I did not come here to be seen," she said. "I came here because after many years away, this was the only place I could stand near music again without having to belong to it." The sentence drifted through the hall and settled over the audience like snowfall. No one interrupted. No one dared. There was too much quiet grief inside those words, too much evidence of a life the room had not earned the right to inspect. Holloway lowered his eyes. In all his years of commanding rehearsals and judging frightened students, he had rarely felt genuine shame. Regret, yes. Professional frustration, often. But shame was different. Shame arrived when a person realized the flaw was not in the moment but in themselves. He had not humiliated Clara Bennett because of one bad impulse. He had humiliated her because somewhere over the years he had trained himself to believe that status was visible, that greatness announced itself through pedigree, posture, or polished introductions. Clara's mere presence had exposed how shallow that belief truly was. Judge Halston turned toward Holloway, then toward the conservatory board seated in the donor section. His next words were calm, but they landed with the force of a verdict. "I think," he said, "Robertson has some explaining to do, not just to Ms. Bennett, but to every student we claim to teach about listening." Those words lingered over the hall with the weight of formal judgment. Robertson had spent decades teaching prodigies to hear microscopic imperfections in pitch, rhythm, and phrasing, yet somehow every trained ear in the building had missed the loudest truth standing right in front of them for 6 months. No one argued with Judge Halston because no one could. The accusation was too precise. A conservatory that claimed to worship sound had failed at listening to character. Clara Bennett remained near center stage, hands folded lightly, shoulders relaxed, as if she were waiting for someone to ask whether the music folders still needed to be sorted after the gala. That quietness made the discomfort in the room almost unbearable. People could have managed anger. They could have defended themselves against outrage. But Clara offered neither. She gave them no dramatic tears, no wounded speech, no righteous condemnation to push against. She simply stood there with dignity intact, and that forced everyone else to sit alone with their own behavior. Maestro Vincent Holloway felt every second of it. The chandeliers above him, once symbols of prestige, now seemed mercilessly bright. He became acutely aware of the microphones, the donors, the students, the board members, the faculty peers who had admired his command for years. Admiration was a fragile thing. It often survived mistakes, but it rarely survived public pettiness. Holloway understood with growing horror that this evening would not be remembered for scholarship winners or guest performances. It would be remembered as the night Vincent Holloway mocked Clara Bennett. He took one step toward her. "Miss Bennet," he said, voice lower now, stripped of its earlier theatrical confidence, "I owe you an apology." The sentence sounded unfamiliar coming from him, almost physically uncomfortable. Students turned sharply. Some had never heard their maestro apologize for anything, not missed notes, not brutal critiques, not reduced tears in rehearsal. Clara met his gaze calmly. Holloway continued, each word slower than the last because pride was resisting all of them. "My conduct was beneath the standards of this institution." He paused, then corrected himself with visible effort. "No. Beneath the standards of simple decency." A faint murmur moved through the audience. This was no polished public relations statement. It was too clumsy, too late, too raw. Which made it real. Holloway inhaled. "I judged you by the role I assigned you before I ever bothered to know who you were." The confession settled like dust. Clara's expression did not change, but several students visibly winced because they recognized themselves inside his sentence. They had all assigned her a role. Folder carrier. Copier operator. Coffee runner. Background person. Human furniture. Never once had they considered that the quiet woman adjusting their music stands might possess a level of mastery they were years away from touching. Judge Halston watched silently, arms folded. The board members in the donor section exchanged tense looks, sensing the institutional fallout that would follow. Yet something more important was happening than damage control. For perhaps the first time in years, Robertson Conservatory was being forced into humility. Nathan Cole slowly began to clap. The single sound startled the room. Not celebratory. Not triumphant. It sounded almost reverent. Elise Turner joined him. Then another student. Then another. Within seconds, the hall filled with sustained applause, but it was different from ordinary concert applause. This was not for technical brilliance alone. This was for the unbearable lesson hidden inside it. Clara looked slightly overwhelmed now, not by attention, but by the sincerity replacing mockery in hundreds of faces at once. Holloway stepped back, yielding the center completely. He knew he no longer belonged in it. Judge Halston inclined his head toward Clara and asked softly, "Would you honor us with one more piece? Not as an employee. Not as an accident. As the artist you are." Clara hesitated. Her eyes moved across the hall, over students who had laughed, patrons who had stared, faculty who had ignored her existence, and finally to the stage floor where a few minutes earlier she had walked in humiliation. The room held its breath again, but this time not from curiosity. This time they were waiting for mercy. Clara Bennet did not answer immediately. Her fingers rested lightly against the polished wood of the violin while the applause faded into a silence so delicate that even the rustle of evening gowns seemed intrusive. Mercy was a difficult thing to offer people who had just finished underestimating you, and every face in Robertson Conservatory knew it. Judge Halston waited with patient respect. Maestro Vincent Holloway stood a few feet behind, hands clasped in front of him now, no longer resembling the untouchable authority who had commanded the stage earlier that night. Clara lifted her eyes toward the upper balcony where the chandeliers scattered pale reflections across the mahogany walls. For a brief moment she looked like someone listening to voices no one else could hear, perhaps old applause, perhaps old grief, perhaps the quiet years she had spent pretending music no longer lived inside her. Then she gave a small nod. "One piece," she said. No one moved. The assistant rushed forward to return the Stradivarius, but Clara gently shook her head. Her gaze shifted toward the line of student instruments resting on velvet chairs. She stepped down from center stage and walked to the nearest stand, where Elise Turner's violin lay waiting. It was a good conservatory instrument, valued at maybe $12,000, respectable but nowhere near legendary. Clara lifted it with calm familiarity. The gesture sent a murmur through the faculty because everyone understood what she was doing. Greatness does not need expensive packaging. Clara returned to center stage carrying the student violin and a plain bow that lacked the gleam of museum varnish and donor prestige. She settled it beneath her chin. This time there were no smirks, no whispers, no concealed amusement. There was only expectation sharpened by humility. She closed her eyes and drew the first note. It was Bach. Not Paganini's fireworks, not a flashy demonstration meant to overwhelm, but Bach's chaconne, the kind of piece that strips a player completely bare because it demands not just technique, but soul. The sound that emerged from Elise Turner's modest instrument seemed impossible. Warm, aching, luminous. Clara shaped each phrase as if she were speaking to something invisible but deeply familiar. Notes rose and folded back on themselves like prayer. The recital hall that had felt grand and judgmental an hour earlier now felt almost sacred. One donor quietly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Elise Turner pressed trembling fingers to her lips. Nathan Cole bowed his head. Even students who had spent their lives chasing precision suddenly understood that precision was only the doorway. Clara was showing them what lived beyond it. As the music deepened, the years she had never explained somehow became audible without a single spoken detail. Loss was there. Endurance was there. Solitude. Grace. The strange stubborn tenderness required to keep loving something after life has taken you far from it. Judge Halston lowered himself slowly back into his chair, overcome. Vincent Holloway stared at Clara with an expression bordering on devastation because this second performance was doing what the first had not fully completed. The Paganini caprice had destroyed his arrogance. Bach was dismantling his entire philosophy. For years Holloway had trained students to dominate rooms, to impress juries, to conquer stages. Clara was doing none of those things. She was simply telling the truth through wood and string, and truth was proving far more powerful than display. When the final chord faded, it did not feel like the end of a piece. It felt like the end of an illusion. Several seconds passed before anyone remembered how to respond. Then the entire hall rose. Not in polite appreciation. Not in donor courtesy. Every person stood because remaining seated suddenly felt disrespectful to something larger than performance. The standing ovation thundered through Robertson Conservatory, but Clara did not bask in it. She lowered the violin, opened her eyes, and looked out at the sea of changed faces with the same quiet composure she had carried when sorting folders in the office. And that was when Vincent Holloway realized the most crushing part of all: she had never needed this room's validation. The room had needed hers. The standing ovation seemed endless, wave after wave of applause crashing against the mahogany walls, rising to the chandeliers, pouring back down over the stage where Clara Bennett stood with nothing but a borrowed student violin in her hands. Yet the most remarkable thing in Robertson Conservatory was not the sound. It was the faces. Students who had once brushed past her in hallways now looked at her as though seeing the true shape of humility for the first time. Faculty members who prided themselves on cultivated sophistication stood blinking rapidly, embarrassed by how easily sophistication had confused itself with wisdom. Donors who had arrived expecting polished entertainment now found themselves witnessing something infinitely rarer, a public correction of human arrogance. Clara let the applause continue for a few moments, then gently handed Elise Turner's violin back to its owner. Elise accepted it with trembling reverence, as if the instrument itself had been transformed. Maestro Vincent Holloway stepped forward, but this time there was no spotlight in his posture, no command in his stride. He looked like a man approaching a truth he could no longer negotiate with status. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice barely carrying above the fading applause, "Robertson Conservatory would be honored to offer you any position you desire here. Faculty consultant. Resident artist. Guest instructor. Name it." The audience quieted instantly. It was the kind of institutional rescue everyone expected, the formal attempt to repair a catastrophic mistake with titles and prestige. Holloway continued, swallowing visible pride. "We would also like to issue a public statement recognizing your extraordinary legacy." Clara listened without interruption. Her face remained composed, almost kind, which somehow made Holloway's desperation more transparent. For years this institution had measured worth through resumes, endorsements, donor dinners, and framed achievements on office walls. Now it was trying to use those same tools to buy back dignity it had failed to grant freely. Clara folded her hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I did not come here looking for recognition." Holloway blinked. The board members exchanged anxious glances. Clara looked out across the hall, and when she spoke again, every syllable landed with the quiet force of final judgment. "I came because 6 months ago I was not ready to return to a stage. I only wanted to be near music again. To hear scales through open doors. To smell rosin in rehearsal rooms. To remember without being asked to perform." Several students lowered their eyes. Clara continued. "You all gave me that, even if you did not know you were giving it." There was no bitterness in her tone, and that absence cut deeper than accusation ever could have. She had every right to embarrass them, to lecture them, to make them kneel inside their own guilt. Instead she offered perspective, and perspective is often the most merciless mirror. Judge Halston smiled faintly, recognizing grace when he saw it. Holloway looked stricken. "Then at least allow us to apologize properly," he said. Clara turned toward him. For the first time that night, a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was not triumphant. It was simply knowing. "Maestro," she replied, "you already did." Holloway frowned, confused. Clara glanced toward the audience, the students, the faculty, the donors, the board, all of them standing witness beneath the harsh honesty of chandelier light. "You gave everyone in this room a lesson they will remember far longer than any scholarship performance tonight." The realization moved visibly across Holloway's face. His humiliation had become the classroom. His arrogance had become the cautionary tale. Clara picked up her worn cardigan from the music stand where she had left it before being called on stage. She slipped it over her shoulders, transforming in seconds from the evening's miracle back into the quiet office woman they thought they knew. That simple motion struck the room harder than the standing ovation. Greatness had not changed clothes to impress them. Greatness had simply revealed itself.